The poor girl was humiliated at the shooting site, but they didn't know that her husband was the CEO. "If you weren't so short, I wouldn't have to shoot like this." The photographer's words cut through Nan Jinwan like a knife as she stood trembling under the harsh studio lights. What the arrogant crew didn't realize was that the woman they were humiliating was married to Hua Xingqian, the CEO, who owned the entire building they were standing in. Imagine being treated like dirt by people who would fall to their knees if they knew your true identity. In the next 15 minutes, you'll witness how a woman's quiet dignity in the face of cruelty becomes her greatest weapon, and how appearances can be the most deceiving currency in a world obsessed with status. This isn't just another rags to riches story. It's a masterclass in patience, justice, and the power of knowing your own worth. Nan Jinwan stood under the glaring heat of the studio lights, her hands hanging loosely by her sides, though her fingers fidgeted ever so slightly against the fabric of her worn dress. The director's tone was sharp, his voice cutting through the careful silence of the room like shards of glass. "If you weren't so short, I wouldn't have to shoot like this." His irritation echoed, drawing quiet chuckles from the models who stood nearby, their perfect faces frozen in expressions of practiced disinterest, a disinterest laced with an air of superiority. The studio was crowded but devoid of warmth. Assistants hurried in and out, lights clicked on and off, and the soft mechanical clicks of the camera created a rhythm that Nan could almost feel pulsating in her chest. But in the chaos, the sneering faces of the others became the loudest observation. There was no camaraderie here. The taller models exchanged amused glances, their whispered remarks punctuated with quiet bouts of laughter. They didn't bother to hide their disdain, not that they needed to. They believed her unworthiness was self-evident, written in her every move, every polite nod, every effort to shrink into the background and avoid drawing more attention to herself. "Maybe we should use a stool for her," someone muttered from behind a softly glimmering gold reflector. The comment lingered, audible enough, needle-sharp, even as the speaker masked it with feigned innocence. Their laugh, shallow and practiced, made Nan's jaw tighten. She refused to let her resolve crack. Not in front of these people. Her height was never a problem until now. But here in this room, it seemed like all of her perceived flaws were magnified, her vulnerabilities put on display under the studio's unforgiving lights. She folded her fingers tightly over her left wrist, adjusting the delicate bracelet there without thought. A simple accessory, but one that whispered something unsaid. If only they knew what this bracelet represented. The diamond set into it caught the light briefly, a flicker that held more weight than they could ever imagine. But no one noticed. Not yet. The photographer called for a reset. Disinterest lined his face as he sighed deeply and waved her off the set, muttering as though her presence alone was too much effort to endure. Nan's shoulders stiffened. She wanted to scream. She wanted to dissolve through the cracks in the polished marble floor. But she did neither. With quiet determination, she stepped off the set, her head slightly bowed to avoid catching anyone's eye. They expected despair, humiliation, perhaps even an apology to tumble from her lips. But no such thing came. Her dignity remained intact because she chose to keep it that way. Anne struggled to fight back the swirl of emotions simmering within her chest was almost unbearable. The ridicule, the jeers, they clashed against the echoes of a voice in her mind saying, "This isn't who you are. You know who you are." Somewhere beneath the humiliation, a small ember of defiance flickered to life. Her hands lifted, out of instinct, or perhaps resignation, to straighten the thin strap of her dress. The gesture was small, calculated, almost unnoticeable to anyone else. But to Nan, it was a deliberate choice. No matter what they said, no matter their sneers, she would not fold beneath them. She would stand tall as her stature allowed. "You're holding everyone up, darling," one of the models chimed in. Her tone was artificially sweet, in a way that made Nan hate how much power her voice seemed to carry. Someone from the far corner of the room stifled a laugh poorly, the sound ringing louder than it should have in the cold air. They all assumed they understood Nan's story. assumed they understood her place. A girl like her, they thought, could only belong here as a charity case, or as a mistake, nothing more. Then Dan silently wondered, not for the first time, how she had ended up here. How had she allowed herself to fall so far into their game, their scrutiny? She wasn't one of them, she knew that much, but still, a set of hopeful circumstances, an innocuous opportunity to stand in for a no-show, had landed her in a place she hadn't prepared herself to navigate. What startled her wasn't just their cruelty, but the realization she hadn't let it break her. Not yet. Not completely. The photographer barked something brief and unkind, a command laced with impatience. Nan tried to concentrate, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. Her hands trembled faintly, her breathing shallower than she liked. She hated that they could see her nerves, or at least sense them, even though she worked hard to conceal them beneath the practiced mask of calm. She curled her toes into the insoles of her simple ballet flats, flat, unassuming, and painfully out of place among the glinting designer heels worn by the others, grounding herself here in the moment. As the photographer stepped closer to reposition her, more carefully controlled snickers tittered through the room. He stared through her as if she were a flawed piece of furniture, turning her slightly by the shoulders while muttering, "Just don't move. Once the light catches her properly, maybe the shot won't be completely unusable." Bile rose in her throat. A piece of furniture. That's how it felt. Disposable. Unnecessary. Suddenly, Nan's thoughts drifted, not forward, but backward, to quiet nights spent standing alone on an apartment balcony, tracing the line of an unfamiliar signature across the lawyer's contract that marked the beginning of something she wasn't sure she had truly chosen. Hua shouting, she thought, not with recognition, but with absence. The man was a stranger to her, yet here she was now, inexplicably tied to him. The bracelet on her wrist suddenly felt heavier than its tiny metals could explain. She didn't correct her posture right away, but when she did, it was deliberate. She drew herself upward, not as a disguise, but as a reminder to herself, steadying her breath and pushing the quiet strength at her core to the surface. One of the models raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching as if to mock the movement, but Nan ignored her. Slowly, her chin tipped upward. Small changes, minute adjustments of her stance communicated something she couldn't. Nobody here knew the truth. They thought she was nothing but a nameless, voiceless fixture, brought into the room to be tolerated for the sake of convenience. But the truth wasn't that simple. It never was. If they understood even a fragment of her story, perhaps their laughter would have caught in their throats. Perhaps the condescension would have morphed into a trepidation. She wondered, for a fleeting instant, what the looks on their faces would be like if they knew what kind of man claimed her name as his wife. What kind of man she awkwardly, uneasily shared vows with, even if the path to understanding those vows was still faint and distant. Her chest burned with an inexplicable mix of pride and uncertainty, a cocktail of thoughts and feelings fighting for dominance within her. If only they knew, she thought fleetingly. If only they knew who I really am. Her time on the set drew to an end quickly after that. They cast her aside as easily as they dismissed her to begin with. The photographer turned his back toward her before dismissing her outright. The models lost interest in mocking her as their gazes shifted toward new distractions, newer, shinier people. In everyone's eyes, Nan had already ceased to exist the moment they deemed her unworthy of their energy. She was glad for their avoidance, yet something boiled under the surface of it all. Anger, threaded with hope. It was a strange combination she hadn't fully reconciled yet, but it fueled her quietly as she moved to step behind the screen and collect her things. She knew this wasn't over. She held her breath and thought again, they'll see one day. One day they'll understand what I've been here all along. And right then, as her steps echoed softly over the marble stretching across the studio floor, she asked herself the same question lingering inside her heart, but only now beginning to form. How had she ended up here? What path led her beneath this overexposed light? What decisions had opened the door to a truth that was undeniably hers, yet impenetrable to everyone else around her? And more importantly, what had she been hiding from even herself? Nan Jinwan sat at the edge of the wooden chair in her small kitchen, staring down at the official letter with trembling hands. Its envelope was stark white, with the lawyer's name embossed in gold, a mockery of the clean life it promised but never delivered. She had opened it earlier that day, the contents concise yet sharp, a reminder of how indifferent some people could be. Her ex-husband was terminating all financial obligations, leaving her with debts and a bitter kind of freedom that tasted like regret. She read the words again, though they rang in her mind as clearly as they had hours ago. Each line stayed heavy, stapled to thoughts of his betrayals. Her breath hitched as she asked aloud, "How did I end up in this life? Married to a man I don't even know?" She was speaking to no one. She had barely gotten through a first marriage, and now found herself tied to another man, whose face remained as unfamiliar as her future. Marrying when she did the first time, out of a desperate hope for love, felt like its own mistake, cold, transactional, and now irreversible. This second marriage seemed crueler, if that was even possible. The difference? No promises of love were exchanged this time. Nan's hands fell limply into her lap, and the bracelet, the one she still couldn't decide whether to cherish or resent, shifted on her wrist. Was this weight commitment, or simply a reminder of her family's control? "It's not normal," her stepmother had said, weeks before the ceremony, pacing circles around Nan's chair as she spoke. A short laugh had followed. "A girl like you, married to a man like him. Do you think you'll ever get another chance like this? This isn't about you. It's about us, about your father. This is the future resting on your shoulders. The future." At the time, Nan hadn't had the courage to ask whether it was her family's future, or hers, that they were referring to. It didn't matter. They pushed her forward like she was a piece on a chessboard, nudged toward Hua shouting with promises she hadn't asked for, and expectations she couldn't hope to meet. Everything about the arrangement was cloaked in mystery, except for the parts her stepmother had deemed necessary for Nan to perform correctly. She hadn't met Huo beforehand. They hadn't even exchanged written words, let alone spoken ones. The man existed in whispers between lawyers and contracts, hidden within the boundary of a signature. Nan knew his name, his reputation, his stature, but names couldn't speak. Reputations held no warmth, and stature only cast shadows. From the rumors she overheard, Hua Shading was a man who controlled empires, his influence rippling through industries that seemed untouchable. To everyone else, he radiated confidence and power. To Nan, however, he was just a ghost of expectation, following her into an alliance she had neither pursued nor understood. Perhaps the part she resented most wasn't even the hollow marriage, but how much her family had maneuvered her into it. Every word they spoke before the wedding reeked of self-interest. "Do you know what this man can do for us?" her father had asked, surprising her with the rare clarity in his tone. "If you care about me, Nan, you'll go through with it. You owe us this much." It wasn't a question in the end, though her stepmother liked pretending it had ever been up for debate. And Nan's quiet agreement, and after what her ex-husband did, after what she'd already endured, it felt pointless to argue she deserved anything more than what they had decided for her. She remembered signing the marriage papers alone, hidden in the stillness of a quiet room. It was quick, clinical. Nothing about the day felt celebratory. No ceremonial exchange of vows, no flowers or softly spoken words. Just her name beside his, permanently handwritten in black ink between lines of cold text. The absence of Hu Shaoding himself at their wedding was the part that confused her most. Her family had assured her that he was far too busy to attend such events in person. But that excuse had only tightened the dull knot of dread sitting in her chest. How did someone so grand, so untouchable, orchestrate something so intimate, yet remain so resolutely absent? The silence he left behind wasn't reassuring. It was deafening. Even now, weeks later, she didn't know what his voice sounded like. Was it as cold as the lawyer who handed her the contract? Or was it calm, measured, and sharp, like the photograph? If there had been more to uncover behind his striking presence, none hadn't had time to see it. And yet, as empty as the arrangement felt, there was more to it than she let herself admit. Something about her new husband's absence wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. She suspected there was a reason Hua Shaoqing had agreed to marry a stranger in such a distant, disconnected way. But the answer hung further out of reach than she wanted to chase. If she found it, what would it change? Everything she lacked now? Trust, companionship, real connection? Would any revelation about him give it back? She wanted to blame him for it all, but that nagging voice reminded her that living with shadows wasn't unique to her marriage. That emptiness had followed her long before it began. When Nan's stepmother appeared in her apartment one day, shortly after the wedding, her tone was almost bitter, as though even the massive business deal they'd secured through Nan's union with Hua hadn't satisfied whatever greed burned in her chest. Surely, she cooed while running a gloved hand over Nan's plain countertop. "You're not unhappy, are you? It's not as though you'd have gotten anything better with the mess your poor choices left behind." Poor choices. The words stung more than her stepmother probably intended, reopening half-healed wounds from Nan's first marriage. That man had promised her everything once, a life that felt stable and loving. He'd smiled while lying. But it wasn't even the heartbreak from loving him that left scars. It was how easily he discarded her that haunted her nights. When they separated legally, the unraveling of their lives together wasn't slow or mournful. It was cold, abrupt, clinical, functioning like precision surgery, calculating which threads of intimacy to cut, while ensuring no emotion got in the way. His letter through the lawyer confirmed what she had already accepted. Her usefulness to him had ended, so she ceased to matter. The debts he left in her name only proved how little regard he'd had in the first place. At least Hu Shaoting hadn't tried to deceive her that way. Or so she told herself during lonely nights, when self-pity started creeping in. His version of marriage wasn't pretending to love her. It was pretending their union existed at all. Smoothing out the crinkled edges of her ex-husband's empty letter, Nan reflected on how sharply different her situation felt now. The constraints of this newer, unparalleled arrangement came with different stakes. There was no warmth, but there was structure. There were no words, but there was still paperwork that positioned her as something or someone more defiant than she thought. Slowly, very slowly, it dawned on her. Even in confusion, she still had questions she didn't dare answer to herself about Hua. Especially dangerous were the nights pondering what that man, not the details surrounding his empire, but his real motivations, thought about tying anything, including his permanence, back to her pledges. Her mind jumped between fragmented answers, never resting long enough to land on clarity. Sometimes, she reasoned, it felt safer never navigating who Hua Shaoting was. Keeping his presence distant wrapped those truths conveniently under controlled separation. Yet the puzzle nagged. Why sign himself to me then? Rich families expand dynasties carefully. Her undercurrent whispered haphazard like stakes. Could there really have been external threats? Nan pushed herself upright instinctively, mind tightening for later contingencies. Perhaps unwillingly suspecting wealthier lives funded secretalities, quietly suspecting underneath centralities. Nan Qinhuan stood in the shadowed dimness of her family home, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn bag. Her stepmother's voice sliced through the stifling air. "Ungrateful and selfish, that's what you are. Do you think doing the bare minimum for this family is enough?" Qiao Hilian's words were laced with venom, her expression one of exasperated disdain, as though Nan had committed the gravest offense by simply standing there. Nan felt her throat tighten, but she didn't respond immediately. She had already learned that speaking out only led to further accusations. Instead, she focused on the floor, on the gaudy marble tiles that gleamed under the chandelier. The same chandelier her father had bought last year, using money Nan had painstakingly earned from working late shifts. Its shine reminded her of the way they drained her, cleaning her out for their next indulgence. Yet it still never seemed enough for them. "I'm doing everything I can," Nan replied, her voice carefully measured, though the tremor behind it betrayed her. It was an automatic response, one she had said so many times before that it barely sounded like her anymore. A spark of satisfaction crossed her stepmother's face, as though she had won already, had wrung this small submission out of Nan with as little effort as someone brushing lint from their coat. "Doing everything you can?" Xiao Yan scoffed, her manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table. The sound ticked like a countdown, each tap louder than the last. "If this is your best, Nan, then I pity us all. Have you seen your father lately? Have you seen what the stress is doing to him? I think," she paused dramatically, raising her chin just slightly, "I think you're trying to get your dad killed." Nan froze. The cruelty of the remark hit her before her brain could even process its meaning. For a moment, it was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The weight of those words landed squarely on her chest, knocking loose every carefully assembled defense she had left. How could someone weaponize her love for father so effortlessly, so precisely? Her lips parted slightly, though no words found their way out. I'm not," she stammered, but Xiao Qian cut her off, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction at the reaction she had provoked. "You're not? Then prove it," Xiao Qian countered, leaning into Nian with a sharpness that made her stature seem larger than it was. "When I tell you we need money, Nian, we're not asking. You think this is about choice? Do you even understand what we've sacrificed to make sure you've had a roof over your head?" Nan's pulse pounded in her ears as the accusations continued, each one layered upon the last like bricks in an ever-growing wall meant to trap her. "After everything your father has done for you," Hillian added, her voice softening into an almost saccharine tone that was somehow worse than her anger, "all we ask is that you do your part." Is that really so much? Her part. That was what her stepmother always called it, as if being financially drained and emotionally manipulated was merely fulfilling some mundane duty. Nan couldn't count the number of times she'd heard variations of that phrase growing up. Her part was always larger than everyone else's. It was sacrificing, obeying, giving until there was almost nothing left. Meanwhile, Hillian had no problem draping herself in expensive silks and parading around in designer heels, her lifestyle an unspoken reminder of where Nan's efforts went. Her stepmother leaned back in her chair, the confrontation momentarily over, but the tension in the room remained. Nan glanced toward her father, who sat quietly in the corner, his presence so muted it was almost ghost-like. He avoided meeting her eyes he always did when Hillian spoke like this. She didn't know if it was shame, fear, or just apathy that kept him silent, but his lack of defense hurt as much as his wife's words. Her father, the man she had looked up to as a child, now seemed diminished, a faint outline of the person she remembered. Despite everything, her heart ached for him. She knew he wasn't blameless, but she couldn't shake the love she had for him either, or the sense of duty that clung tightly to it. Still, the anger bubbling inside her was becoming harder to suppress. It wasn't just the unfairness of the demands placed on her. It was the complete lack of acknowledgement of any gratitude or understanding of her sacrifices. This family they spoke of wasn't something she felt a part of anymore. It was a hierarchy, and she was firmly at the bottom, expected to prop everyone else up while they drained her dry. Nan swallowed hard, her hands clutching the bag strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I can't give you more money right now," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. It wasn't much, but it was a line she hadn't dared to draw before. Hillian's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening in an instant. The room seemed to grow colder. "What do you mean you can't?" Hillian's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "Are you seriously standing here, in this house your father provided for you, telling me no?" Nan met her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't drop her eyes. "Yes," she said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground. "I've done everything you've asked. I've supported all of you while working jobs that barely pay my bills, and I physically can't give you more. I'm not going to." For a moment, silence filled the room. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of something brewing just beneath the surface. Killian's face darkened, her lips parting as if to unleash a torrent of fresh anger. But Nan didn't wait to hear it. She turned toward the front door, her steps quick and deliberate, as if putting distance between herself and them would somehow free her from the invisible chains they had wrapped around her. It wasn't until she was outside, the evening air cool against her flushed face, that she finally allowed herself to take a shaky breath. Her resolve had held, but the encounter had left her drained in ways she couldn't begin to describe. Her feet carried her to the bus stop nearby, where she sank onto one of the cold metal benches. She pushed her hair back from her face, trying to collect herself. In the darkness of the street, her reflection in the glass of the advertisement panel caught her eye. For the first time, she didn't see someone weak. She didn't see the powerless, desperate girl her family had tried to paint her as. She saw someone tired, yes, but also someone still standing. That counted for something. Nan's thoughts drifted as she remembered the job she had interviewed for earlier that week. It was nothing glamorous, a part-time position at a small flower shop, but the idea of earning money on her own terms, without her family's interference, felt like a lifeline she desperately needed. She hadn't heard back yet, but the memory of filling out the application form and sitting across from the kind angel, the sound of the bus approaching, broke her reverie. She stood as the vehicle pulled to a stop, the doors hissing open. As she stepped on and dropped a few coins into the fare slot, she felt a cautious resolve building inside her. This wasn't the end of her struggles with her family, not by a long shot, but tonight had been a small victory, a reminder that she could push back, even as the odds remained stacked against her. As the bus rumbled forward, Nan stared out the window, the city lights flickering past in a blur. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a while, she felt like it was hers to navigate. She couldn't ignore the pressure still looming over her, from her family, from her circumstances, and from the unknown surrounding her strange marriage. But the first steps toward reclaiming her independence had already been taken. She didn't know where they would lead, but she was willing to find out, one step at a time. Nan Jinwan stood stiffly in the center of the cramped back office, her body angled defensively, as her boss, Mr. Du, leaned casually against his desk, smirking at her with thinly veiled disdain. His voice was low but sharp, the words slicing through the air. "You don't want to pay? Then you'll have to sell yourself to make up the debt." He said it without hesitation, as if it were an unremarkable statement, as ordinary as asking about the weather. Nan flinched inwardly, but her face remained outwardly composed. She didn't trust herself to speak, not immediately. The waves of disgust rising in her chest were nearly overwhelming, but fear threatened to drown them out. She felt as though Mr. Du could see every corner of her vulnerability, as if he fed off the hesitation in her silence. The strong power imbalance between them was palpable. His sneering confidence, her precarious financial. She clenched her hands into fists at her sides, feeling her nails dig into her palms to stop them from trembling. A dress. The ridiculous, overpriced dress she had been coerced into borrowing for a photo shoot had become the noose tightening around her. The dress hung crookedly on the rack beside her, its shimmering fabric catching the dim light of the office, like some taunting relic of her mistake. Taking it had seemed harmless at first. One of the senior models had suggested it casually, grinning as she convinced Nan that wearing something decent would make the photographer take her seriously. "They won't even photograph you if you walk in looking like that," the model had said, pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders as her eyes lingered critically on Nan's outfit. Nan had felt the sting of those words more deeply than she cared to admit, and against her better judgment, she went along with the advice, blindly borrowing the dress. She thought it was a temporary fix, an investment in better opportunities, but now she understood the trap. Everything in this industry came with a price. "Your silence is an answer, I suppose," Mr. Dew said, his smirk deepening as he slowly pushed himself off the edge of his desk. He moved toward her with deliberate steps, his polished shoes clacking against the floor in a rhythm that felt unnervingly rehearsed. You brought this on yourself, Miss Nan. Surely you understand that. It's not my fault you couldn't manage your finance. Nan's pulse quickened as he stopped just inches from her. She could feel her breathing grow shallower, her heart racing with a mix of panic and fury. She wanted to scream at him, to demand how this could possibly be her fault, when none of it felt like her choice to begin with. But words escaped her. The cool, calm satisfaction etched across Mr. Dew's face made her feel smaller than she already did. He stepped back, as if even standing near her was a task, and gestured lazily to the dress. You owe me $20,000. Unless, of course. His dark gaze swept over her, making her spine draw rigid. You're willing to work off the debt? Her stomach churned. Work off the debt. The implication hung between them, unmistakable and revolting. She tightened her arms across her torso protectively, her mind racing. This wasn't a negotiation. He wasn't twisting a knife, exploiting her, banking on her desperation to force her into submission. And the worst part? He was probably used to winning these battles. How many others had stood in this same room, faced with the same cornered ultimatum, and caved? Nan's voice came before she realized she was speaking, breaking through the thick tension like a match striking a flame. I'm not someone who would do anything for money. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven, but her words were strong, firm. She repeated each syllable in her mind, as if committing them to memory. She needed her own voice to stay with her, because nothing else in this moment would. That single sentence seemed to stop him for a brief moment. His eyebrows twitched slightly, and the smirk on his lips faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed to see, though it was enough. Somewhere deep beneath his smug exterior, there was at least a trace of surprise at her defiance. But he recovered quickly. I see, he replied dryly, crossing his arms over his chest, as though she were no more significant than a mildly amusing inconvenience. You want to play the moral high ground, but take a good look at where that's gotten you. His eyes flicked toward the dress, and then back to her, narrowing as the first hint of irritation crept into his tone. You can't afford it. You can't pay for it. The words sent a shiver down her spine, but Nan held her ground. She felt her palm brushing against the crumpled receipt in her pocket, the one she had tucked there earlier, as if it might be her lifeline. The tiny, insignificant piece of paper felt like a taunting reminder of the debt she carried, that the struggle wasn't transient or distant. It was here, pinned to every fiber of her life. She reached her hand into her pocket, clutching the receipt tightly, using its sharp edges to anchor herself. When she spoke again, her voice didn't waver. I don't owe you my dignity, and I won't stay here a second longer to let you think I do. The room felt impossibly still in the aftermath of her words. Mr. Dew stared at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before it twisted into something sharper, angrier. You really think anyone's going to back you up on this? He sneered, gesturing vaguely toward the door, as though to imply the entire fashion world waited on the other side, ready to condemn her further. You're already nothing. If you defy me, no one is going to step in to save you. Nan didn't flinch this time. She had nothing left to lose from walking away, but everything to lose from staying. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the office door, her chin lifted just enough to show the smallest spark of defiance. The whispers outside were already beginning, growing louder and sharper as the models and staff outside pretended to busy themselves but clearly hung on every word that had been exchanged within. She could feel their stares on her as she emerged, every glance heavy with judgment or pity. Such a fool, one of the models muttered, her perfectly glossed lips curling into a smirk as she leaned against a corner. Another added with a low whisper, "That's career suicide. What does she think she's proving?" Nan heard it all. It flowed past her like cold air, chilling but not undoing her. They thought her story ended here, that this marked her downfall, her inevitable tumble into irrelevance. None of them understood that for the first time in a long while, she had taken back a sliver of control. Let them stare. Let them mock. Let them believe she was shattered. She still had her dignity. And for now, that was enough. She clutched the receipt in her hand as she walked. Its edges were crumpled and soft from her grip, but it felt heavier now, weighted by everything it had come to represent, an emblem of her burden, but also her quiet refusal to carry more than she could. The hum of the city outside called to her as she pushed open the studio's double doors, resisting the urge to look back. She felt the whispers following her out, fading as the doors swung shut. What she didn't see, as she disappeared into the evening light, was a brief moment of pause from one shadowed figure in the hallway. One of the assistants had stepped aside at the sound of her departure, their cautious gaze following her until she disappeared from view. Their lips parted, as if to say something, but they didn't. They simply stood there, caught in the peculiar tension Nan left behind. Nan stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool air flooding her lungs and clearing the stifling taste of the confrontation. Her pace slowed, as the weight on her shoulders seemed to shift, not entirely lifted, but lighter somehow. There were no cheers, no medals for walking away with her pride intact. She knew the price she'd pay in isolation, knew the doors that might close before she ever reached them again. But none of them compared to the cost of staying. As she glanced downward, still clutching the receipt, flashes of memory flickered in her mind. Her stepmother's sharp words, her father's silence, her boss's smirk, and the empty words of the lawyer who had handed her a future she'd never asked for. A storm brewed inside her chest, emotions she couldn't quite name twisting and churning, but one thought floated clearly above the rest. This wasn't over. Somewhere in a quiet office, in a place even she didn't know, there was a man she had yet to truly meet, a man whose name she bore, but whose face was only a portrait in her mind. She didn't know when or how, but she felt that somehow this invisible tie between them would become unavoidable. And whether for help, for hope, or simply for answers, the unspoken name repeated itself like a steady heartbeat, shouting. Under the bustle of the corporate world, names floated in casual conversations, names that everyone seemed to know, but no one dared to question. Hua Shouting was one of them. His name carried weight, enough that his presence was felt without him ever having to show up in person. Yet for reasons only he knew, he had chosen to remain hidden in plain sight, especially from the one person whose life was most entwined with his, Nanjin Wan. The irony of the situation could almost be called cruel. Day after day, Nan walked into the building owned by the very man she was married to, utterly unaware of the layered web of power and influence at play. The Huao Group's name adorned sleek walls and company announcements, but to her, it was just another giant bureaucracy, indifferent to those like her, who struggled to earn their place. She never imagined that the CEO at the top of this towering empire was the same man whose signature now shared her last name. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching her. It wasn't lost on us. Hua Shouting, though, wasn't watching from a distance, as passively as she might have believed. There was intention in his silence and distance. Everything about him, the mystique, the pretense of detachment, only deepened the mystery behind his actions. His choice to keep his identity from Nan wasn't random or thoughtless. It was calculated, layered with reasons that he kept carefully camouflaged. Like so many men in power, he understood the advantage of remaining unseen, especially when observing those who didn't know they were being watched. For Nan, his absence was a constant, a detachment she had reluctantly accepted. But for Hua, the growing awareness of her presence in his world was anything but passive. Recently, there had been whispers trickling their way up to him. Not formal reports, not scandals, just the low murmur of discontent. Staff turnover and internal memos were easy to ignore. But when Nan's name first caught his attention, it wasn't through official channel. It wasn't even on purpose. A casual mention during a management meeting had piqued his curiosity. Of the freelancers for the ad campaign, she made quite a scene with Du last week. It's a dead end now. She left the position. That's all the executive had said. but the tone carried its own implied judgment. She wasn't worth talking about. Hua didn't say much in response, just leaned back in his seat as the discussion moved on without further mention of her. But inside, something shifted. The whisper turned into a thread to pull, and Hua wasn't a man who ignored threads. It didn't take long to piece together the story. She had borrowed a dress she couldn't afford, faced an ultimatum she shouldn't have had to endure, and ultimately walked away. She had walked away empty-handed, humiliated, sitting at his cold and meticulously organized desk. He caught himself rereading the notes his assistant had casually compiled when asked for more details on the incident. They used straightforward language, no emotion, no judgment. But Hua found himself pausing at the same point every time. She had refused to compromise her dignity. A simple fact, on paper, but one that carried more meaning than the assistant could have imagined when typing it. Most people might have dismissed the name without a second thought. Shouting, however, wasn't most people. He realized it wasn't entirely chance that had brought her up in his orbit now. No, this was inevitable. And as he learned about her struggles within the company, about the people who had mistreated her and the quiet indignities she endured, one thought kept returning to him. What was keeping her silent about her connection to him? Did she even think about it? Or was the gulf between them so wide in her mind that she didn't see how much power one acknowledgement could offer her? The answer unfolded slowly, mostly through echoes of their lives rather than direct dialogue. Nan didn't seek him out. She hadn't called upon him as a lifeline, hadn't whispered his name as a potential rescue. Was it pride? Shame, or disbelief in the reality of their complicated marriage? He wasn't certain yet, and that uncertainty was something new for him. Huo was a man used to absolutes, knowing where the pieces fell, and controlling their outcomes. With Nan, however, the pieces didn't behave as expected. She didn't behave as expected. His need for answers deepened the more he examined her from the quiet perch of distance. His vantage point allowed him to observe, without her knowing, to puzzle through the fragments of her character, emerging between the lines of reports and offhand observation. And in those quiet spaces, something unexpected began to take root. A sense of watching her navigate the skein of harsh realities surrounding her made him question whether his disconnection from her had gone too far, whether the gap between them was something he had let become too wide. Huo wasn't often a man consumed by introspection, but he found himself replaying moments of their legal union in his mind like a silent sequence of photos. There had been no ceremony, no close witnesses, just the cold exchange of signatures beneath the austere glare of indoor lighting. He had told himself then that a paper agreement was all they needed. Simple, clean, without complication. Now, however, after seeing the fallout of that very simplicity, he regretted underestimating how messy the gaps between them could become. He glanced at his watch. Somewhere on the other side of the city, she was likely sitting in her modest apartment, cautiously nursing the wounds from another day of struggle. He had overheard enough subtle comments to know that she kept herself separate, unwilling to burden anyone, unwilling to reach out. That was what made him pause. She wasn't someone who cried for help to the nearest safety net. She weathered storms in silence that should have made her less visible. Just another hard-working woman lost in a sea of passing faces. Instead, it made her the one he couldn't stop noticing. Huo's internal thoughts, however deliberate and meticulous, might never have reached her. Nan, busy unraveling her own difficult world, had little reason to think her tangled marriage would step into her daily reality. Yet life had a way of presenting its messy truths at the least expected moments. It was during a rare quiet break at the cafe near her part-time job where the first thread began to uncurl before her unsuspecting eyes. A casual remark shared between two colleagues, "Mr. Huan will be in town. Corporate's nervous," was all it took. She wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. The name Huan wasn't so uncommon that it demanded attention, and yet something in her paused when she heard it. A tiny pull, like an invisible string, made her turn her head slightly toward their conversation. The details were vague, Nothing specific, just talk of an air of importance, preparations for his potential arrival at some high-level meeting. It was the way they spoke, the combination of awe and unease in their tones, that stuck with her long after the murmured exchange ended. When she tried to shake it off later, she couldn't. Something about it gnawed at the edges of her mind, and all at once, her thoughts were moving places she hadn't let them go before. If someone asked her outright to describe her husband, she wouldn't know where to begin. Ho Shouting was a figure that lived only in the corners of her thoughts, shrouded in formality and distance. She wore his name like an accessory that didn't belong to her, never quite fitting but there nonetheless. And yet now, inexplicably, she felt herself wondering more deeply about the man behind it than she ever had. Not in terms of lofty romantic imaginings, but as a simple need to unravel the mechanics of her own life. I knew what I was signing up for. I thought I did, she caught herself thinking one night, staring blankly out her apartment window at the endless maze of city lights below. Whatever she had expected, it wasn't this disjointed puzzle where her own place remained so wildly unclear, somewhere far away, or perhaps closer than she suspected. Huo contemplated his own role in the tangled web surrounding Nan. While he hadn't intervened yet, partly for reasons of strategy and partly to observe further, the impulse was growing stronger. There would come a moment when the distance between them would need to close, not just for practicality but as a necessity of the choices they were now both enmeshed in. As the days unfolded, hints of his unseen presence began to ripple through her world, though never in ways she could confirm. A manager who addressed her more cautiously than the week before, a sudden opening for a better-paying campaign slot that didn't require her to claw through demeaning hurdles. These weren't coincidences. But Nan, weary from so many battles, let practical gratitude outweigh suspicion. Besides, it wasn't as though she associated these strange shifts in fortune with her shadowy husband. Yet, just beneath the surface, a quiet curiosity burned. The growing puzzle of her circumstances felt like a thread she couldn't deny wanting to pull, if only to see where it unraveled next. And though she didn't know it yet, her quiet persistence and refusal to sink into despair had begun to trigger something more meaningful than curiosity across the invisible chasm between her and Huo. Shouting himself remained shrouded in the same enigma he always had. But for the first time, the still waters beneath his carefully composed life had begun to ripple. He might have told himself he was simply safeguarding the arrangement he had created. He might have told himself his interest came solely from responsibility and fairness. But Hua wasn't an entirely dishonest man, even with himself. Deep down, he knew something else was shifting, and it wasn't a force he was used to controlling. Something about Nan's untiring resilience lit that faint, unfamiliar spark. It flickered at the edge of his usually impenetrable demeanor, and he couldn't quite extinguish it. What neither of them knew yet was how their paths, separate but always faintly tethered, were careening toward each other with growing velocity. The distance between them could not remain unchallenged indefinitely. They shared far too much now, and every step they took within their separate worlds only brought them closer to the inevitable. What would happen when silence no longer separated their lives, when his identity became a barrier impossible to hide? For her, it would mean facing the truths she wasn't prepared to ask. For him, it meant confronting everything he thought staying distant had protected. And for both, it meant a collision that would expose not just their past decisions, but the promises and pains left unspoken in between. The moment loomed before them, impossible to predict, yet impossible to avoid. So, the real question was this: when stakes are hidden behind names and silences, what happens when their worlds finally collide? In a world obsessed with appearances, Non-Genuine's story reveals that true strength lies in self-worth and perseverance. Despite public humiliation and constant betrayal, she held on to her dignity, refusing to compromise her integrity for fleeting survival. Her resilience, shaped in the face of cruelty, turned into the foundation of her ultimate victories: love, justice, and recognition. What would you do if the world underestimated you? Let us know in the comments below. Your story matters too. This is just the beginning of Nan's journey. Stay tuned to see how her unwavering spirit transforms